Well, good morning, everyone. Here in just a few minutes, we're going to begin by reading in Romans chapter 13. We're going to be reading verses 1 through 7. Then we're going to be finishing up toward the end of the talk in Acts chapter 17. So Romans chapter 13, and we'll finish in Acts chapter 17. It's great to be here after a kind of quick trip that me and Holly and Lisa and I made to Texas, and it was a safe trip. We didn't have any major problems or troubles, and all my family's relatively healthy, so that's good. We're very grateful for that. On the ride back, we're driving overnight, and I don't know if anybody here has been on 47 going through Oklahoma, the toll roads. The gas stations are few and far between, and I thought I could make it to a little oasis, and it started running real low. The idiot light came on, and then the needle felt low, empty. So we're sweating it, and I finally found a gas station. Me and Elise were awake at the time, pulled in, and we weren't running on fumes. We were running on prayers at that point. But we made it, gassed up, and the rest of the trip was uneventful. But it's kind of funny. Every time we make a January trip down to Texas, it seems like the country just goes crazy. You know, last January we went down there. All of a sudden they're announcing lockdowns in all these states, and we're wondering, are they going to let us back in, when we get home? And then this time, we get some phone service, because where we stayed, we don't have a signal, but we got up out of the valley and on the road, and I just checked the news real quick, and I saw that people were storming the Capitol building. And it was kind of a crazy week, something that most of us didn't think we'd see in our lifetime. But I kind of get it. We have a new government starting in January. And, I mean, let's be frank and honest here. We can expect this new government to probably be the most hostile administration in Congress that Christianity has seen in this nation's history. We know it's coming. The new president, who claims to be a Catholic, has promised to overturn our current president's executive order that protected religious institutions from being forced to provide things like abortion in their health care, and forcing them to hire people, with LGBT community, no matter what the scriptures say about it. Both President-elect Biden and the Vice President-elect Harris, they both support abortion right up to a child's birth date. And this is not just, throwing out, wild accusations. They are both on the record as saying these things. I don't think they would be upset with me for mentioning this. We can expect attempts to criminalize any rhetoric against LGBT behaviors, even if it's backed by scripture. And they've already tried these in a couple places where churches would be required by law to not offend someone from the LGBT community if they were worshiping with them. So mentioning the first chapter of Romans, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 8 through 10, verse 7 of Jude, and others might possibly be considered hate speech in the coming years, possibly punishable by law. So how, as Christians, are we to react to a hostile government, to these things that we find so frightening and abhorrent that our government is doing? Well, I thought it'd be kind of interesting just to take a quick peek back at the government God set up for his chosen people in the Old Testament, the physical Israel. Now, in that system of government, he gave the Hebrews a written law for them to follow, gave them very specific instructions on legal matters, on health matters, and other matters. And he gave them a priesthood from the lineage of Aaron to teach it to the people of Levi, to teach it to the people. And he gave them judges who were to make decisions on things and to guide and to lead areas of the 12 tribes. I always kind of found it interesting that they were given a flat tax. When people, ask me what I think of a flat tax, I said, well, God thought it was a pretty good idea because that's what he imposed on the Jews in the Old Testament. But they had other sacrifices and fees. For example, every person had to give a half shekel to be paid by the rich and by the poor, just a half shekel for the upkeep of the temple. And I think a lot of our friends in the denominations might be surprised to learn that God commanded the Hebrews to not favor the poor or rich in matters of law. Leviticus 19:15. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. So right was right and wrong was wrong. It didn't matter if these people were poor, this person was rich, whatever. Right was right. If you broke the law should be carried out. Now, the Hebrews saw their neighboring countries with their kings and their armies and their chariots and such, and they clamored for a king of their own. God warned them over and over. He said that a king is going to raise your taxes. It's going to take your daughters and sons for service of the crown. It's going to take the first part of your crops. It's going to lay burdens on them. But they still demanded a king, and so God allowed it. After saying, okay, it's not a good idea, but you want a king, you got it. So the fourth king down refused to listen to wise counsel, and he raised taxes and burdens on the people, which led to a divided kingdom. You now have Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And the kingships for both of these sections of the kingdom proved to be an absolute disaster. The northern kingdom never did have a real, true, godly king. Judah had maybe two after the split, but the evil kings led their subjects into apostasy, and which led God to eventually allow them to be conquered by enemies. Assyria on the north and Babylon later took Judah, the south, and then destroyed the temple in doing so. Now the Persian Empire would allow the Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple, but they would not have full autonomy. Again, they were subject to the Persian rule, then to Greece rule, then to Roman rule. Now, in 1948, Israel became an autonomous nation again, but their entire existence is completely dependent on the United States. Without the United States, there would not be a physical Israel today. So they have autonomy only to a limited sense, where they have to do what we want them to do, or risk losing their funding and losing their very existence. So what about today? What about God's new Israel, the spiritual kingdom that we as Christians are a part of? God's new Israel, his chosen people today, we live in many different countries, pretty much every country on the face of the earth. And they live under almost every type of government conceivable in mankind. If there's a type of government on the earth, somehow Christianity seems to endure. So how could this work? Well, Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7 reads, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore, you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's due. Taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." So we see here how Christianity can survive in all these different nations, all these different forms of government. That's by keeping your head down and by following the law, by not rebelling against these governments, by not causing great stirs and breaking the law and such, but by subjecting yourself to these authorities. Now keep in mind that the government Paul was under when he wrote this letter was the Roman government. It was a hostile government that would eventually put Christians to death in horrific ways by dipping them in pitch and using them as torches, lighting them on fire, by having wild animals tear them apart in the Colosseum. So it was not a godly government by any stretch of the imagination. Yet Paul here is telling them to subject themselves. So Christians were and are commanded to subject themselves to governing authorities, no matter how bad they are. This is very important, and it's reinforced throughout the New Testament. If you want me to give you a list of these scriptures after the service, please feel free to come up to me and I'll give them to you. But 1 Peter chapter 2, 13 through 17 says, obey the governing authorities. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. Titus chapter 3, verse 1. Christ himself in Matthew chapter 22, verse 21, said to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. There's a surprising number of scriptures referring to Christians obeying the governing authorities in the New Testament. As Christians, we are to obey the governing authorities in all things except when it is in direct contradiction to God's commands. So there are rare instances where we are not to obey the governing authorities. If the day comes when it is illegal to gather as brothers and sisters on the first day of the week, and I'm not speaking of emergencies like pandemics and things like that, but as a general rule, if they say Christians, you can no longer gather together, that is a law that we cannot follow. We will still gather. Yeah, maybe we gather in houses, maybe we do it in secret, but that is a law that Christians cannot obey. If we are banned from preaching parts of the gospel, which I think is probably going to be the first thing we see when the persecution really hits the church hard, but if we are banned from preaching parts of the gospel that the world finds offensive, we don't obey the government in that case. If we are barred from disfellowshipping a member for living a lifestyle that the New Testament deems sinful, we do not follow that law. When Peter and the apostles were arrested for their preaching in Acts and told to stop, Peter said we ought to obey God rather than man. So we obey God's commands first, but in civil matters, we obey the government. Do we pay taxes to a government that's funding the murder of the unborn through Planned Parenthood? Yes, we do. Christians, we do. Do we, just like the first and second century Christians, they paid taxes to Rome. Do you think the election was stolen? Still be in subjection to that government. The government begins to persecute you, still be in subjection to that government. As distasteful as it might be to us, as much as we hate some of the government's policies and actions, we still obey that government and follow the laws. And I really wish this person was here, but I've had a person ask me about civil disobedience before, and I always kind of had a little trouble answering that, but when I was doing this lesson, reading this yesterday, it became kind of obvious. The key word in that question is disobedience. Civil disobedience is still disobedience. So I think that the question answers itself. A Christian should not be involved in disobedience. Your cause might be noble, but we are commanded over and over to be in subjection to ruling authorities. Lawful protest, assembling peaceably, organizing politically, yes, these are things that a Christian can do, a Christian can partake in. I'm not saying to back out of government matters altogether. Paul used his status as a Roman citizen on several occasions to make his lot a little better, but he obeyed the law. The important thing to remember is that this country that most of us are very thankful to live in, this is not our permanent residency. This is not our permanent home. John 18, chapter 36, when Jesus had been arrested and brought before Pilate, Pilate asked him, "Are you king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Christ's kingdom is not of this world. So which kingdom are we as Christians focused on the most? I'd like to read now Acts chapter 17, verses 24 through 31. I've read this before in other talks, but it gives me a great deal of comfort in these times when unrest begins to rear its head and things look like they're spiraling out of control. This gives me great, great comfort. Here Paul is speaking to the Areopagus in Athens, and he gives the famous to the unknown God sermon. And in Acts 17, 24 through 31, Paul says, "God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives life and breath, gives to all life, breath, and all things." And here's the important part. "And he has made from one blood every nation of man to dwell on the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by man's art and man's devising. Truly these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. I love that verse. It says, God sets up governments and removes them. God has appointed the times and the places of the nations. He knows when he's going to start them, and he knows when he's going to bring them down. And why does he do this? To further his will, to give mankind the best chance to find him and come to repentance and salvation. If the Lord wanted to remove our current president, if he wanted to remove our coming president-elect, God can do it. He is in charge of all this. God can do these things. If he wanted to remove our godless leaders, if he wants to remove Congress, he can do it on his own. In fact, he might be in the process of doing that right now. We see this as, we're in the middle, possibly with the vaccine, the end of this pandemic. This might just be the beginning, brothers and sisters. There's already fear that there are two new strains starting to burn through that might be vaccine resistant. So we don't know where this is going to go. God may be in the process of taking us down right now. And there are plenty of the lost that he can use to accomplish this. God can use, he has plenty of people who will do his will, whether they know it or not, to accomplish what he wants. As Christians, we need to subject ourselves to governing authorities, to never be seen storming a building or destroying property or engaging in any unlawful activities like we've seen both sides do in the last several months. I'd like to end this morning by quoting from Job chapter 12, and again, I'll give you these verses if you want, but verse 23 through 25 states, he makes nations great and he destroys them. He enlarges nation and he leads them away. He takes away understanding from the chiefs of the people of the earth and makes them wander in a pathless ways. They grope in the dark without light and makes them stagger like a drunken man. Brothers and sisters, God is in control of everything we see going on. All the chaos, all the uncertainty, all these things, God is watching over all this, and his ultimate plan will be accomplished. I'm very grateful to be living in this nation, even at this time when things look like they're unraveling. But I should be, if I'm living the way I'm supposed to be, I should be a Christian before I am an American. Christians, and every one of us, should be Christians first and Americans second. You know, we give this chance every week. You know, chaos and uncertainty things are not always a bad thing. It makes some people concerned, and they start thinking about what would happen if this gets so bad that I die. You know, what if I'm not alive this time next week? It makes people wonder about their salvation, and that's a good thing. If there's anyone here, if you've been added to the Lord's church and you're a Christian, but there's something of this world, if it's a temptation, if it's an anxiety, a health problem, anything at all that's causing you to stumble, we encourage you to come up and ask for prayers and support of the congregation, because that's why we come together as brothers and sisters. That's why I can't be a Christian and worship on my own, because it's our jobs to support each other, to help us stay on that path, that we all might be presented to God perfect on that final day and allowed to live with him forever, for eternity. Also, if you're not yet become a Christian, if you've not been added to his church in baptism, we encourage you. You see how fast things can get scary, how fast things can unravel. We encourage you not to delay, to come forward this morning while we all stand together and sing.